Senator Brown.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. We've just heard a speech from the Leader of the Opposition, which in summary is the soulless talking about sold souls, and a budget full of promise, but not only unfunded and irresponsibly unfunded, but cutting current revenue by, for starters, an $11 billion, which would be over the forward estimates, which would be involved in his repeal of the mining tax. Never, in my experience in this parliament, have so many promises been made by somebody who's going to cut $11 billion out of the budget without explaining how he's going to fund those promises and who he is going to hurt in the process. The one commitment that summed up the philosophy of this Leader of the Opposition is that in set-top boxes he would give the job to Gerry Harvey at the expense of thousands of small businesses around this country. And where the government is allocating money so that pensioners can watch TV without the threat of cutting from their meagre resources, this Leader of the Opposition is a remnant from the government which repeatedly gave $500 cheques to hundreds of thousands of Australians as voting incentive in the run to elections. Australia is an enormously wealthy country and its economy is booming. It has emerged strongly from the global recession with an economic stimulus package which was backed and improved by the Greens, creating hundreds of thousands of jobs. And now there is tremendous economic growth on the back of a resources boom, and mining investment will rise to about 8 times the level preceding the boom, that is $76 billion by 2011-12. We have the highest terms of trade in 140 years. And so the Greens pose this question to both the government and the opposition: how is it that so few are benefiting from the country's great natural wealth? And why is it that there is growing power of the corporate sector, which is the big winner-takes-all section of the economy? We have a two-speed economy and a two-tiered democracy, and upstairs are the mining barons. On the 2nd of May last year, Prime Minister Rudd and Treasurer Swan announced that they would introduce a mining super profits tax based on the Henry Tax Review. The mining industry campaigned against the tax, spending $22 million on an advertising campaign, and as a result they got $100 billion stripped out of the people's revenue over the next decade to line their pockets and very often the pockets of already wealthy people outside this country. Treasury figures show that will indeed be $10 billion lost to budgets, including the budgets a year or two from now, and then consequent years right through to the early 2020s. What could be worse? Well, the revenue that would be lost if there was no mining tax at all. That is, an Abbott government which would strip $140 billion compared with the Henry recommendations which only the Greens endorse over the coming decade. So the mining corporations who employ just 2% of Australians would, under the Abbott prescription, deprive the other 90% of Australians by $140 billion in the coming decade. The companies that are posting record annual profits for 2010 begin in the mining sector. BHP Billiton with $14.9 billion, Rio Tinto $14 billion, Xstrata, an Anglo-Swiss parent company, is based in Switzerland. It's not listed on the Australian Stock Exchange, and in 2010 its net total profit $4.9 billion, operating profit $7.65. And then there's the 4 big banks who would take 12% of a future tax cut, which is in this budget, to the corporate sector. ANZ $4.5 billion, NAB $5.7 billion, Westpac $6.4 billion, CBA $5.7 billion. And, Madam Acting Deputy President, the average Australian worker's salary in Australia is at $65,161 a year, while the average base pay of CEOs It's higher in the companies I've just mentioned, but across the sector is 2,048,892. That is 31 times higher than the wage going to the average workers in the same corporation. The average workers' pay has gone up 52% in the past decade, while CEOs' pay has increased 130%. Compare the 65,000 of average Australian workers with the CEO of BH Billiton, 11 million in 1 year, of Rio Tinto, 9 million, of Woodside Petroleum, 8 million, of ANZ Bank, 10 million, of Commonwealth Bank, 16 million, NAB, 7.7 million, Westpac, 9.5 million. Well, from the economy of boom, let me get back to those who are going to be squeezed. There is a problem in this revenue, in the revenue of this budget, not a problem with spending, and it's only the Greens who are looking at the revenue base of this wealthy economy in a mining boom. But it's been a missed opportunity by Labor and would have been set aside altogether had Tony Abbott been in government. As George Megalogenis noted in The Australian yesterday, I quote, "The Treasurer should be kicking himself that the mining tax wasn't handled better last year. Hindsight says the tax should have been framed to collect in the early years, but cranked up in the second half of the decade. It's too late now because the half-baked mineral resources rent tax, that's Labor's prescription, looks as if it will behave like a fuel excise tax, falling as a share of GDP when the budget needs to grow. The Greens would reinstate the original 40% mining resource tax as recommended by Treasury and collect that $100 billion over the next 10 years. We would drop the cut to corporate tax rate for big business inherent in this budget, and that would save approximately $18 billion over 10 years, $3.1 billion over the forward estimates. As it is, one-third of this anomalous tax break is going to BHP, Rio Tinto and, as I indicated earlier, the 4 big banks alone. That's $3.1 billion in a tax break over the coming 4 years, while the rest of Australians get no tax break at all, but a squeeze is put on millions of poorer Australians in what's not only a two-speed economy, but which is a rapidly growing gap between the rich and poor under Labor, something that we thought would end with the Howard government. Madam Acting Deputy President, the corporate tax cut should only be applying to small business, and we commend the government for that. After all, small business provides 47% of the total employment, or around 5 million jobs in this country. Compare that with the mining industry's 206,000 jobs. That drop for the tax cut to small business, while not handing it over to the much more expensive tax break for the big corporations who are already booming, as I've outlined, would bring Australia in line with the US, UK, Japan and Canada, which have different and often much lower company tax rates for small business. We would remove the fossil fuel subsidies, which total $11 billion a year, including fuel tax credits, which add up to $5 billion a year. The exclusion there being fuel tax credits for farmers, costing just $680 million of that $5 billion. These tax credits mean that while ordinary Australians pay 38 cents tax per litre for their fuel, the big mining corporations pay nothing. So every time an ordinary Australian goes to the petrol bowser, they know they are paying 38 cents more than these massively wealthy mining corporations going to get their fuel in the same country. Greens polling shows that 84% of Australians don't consider it appropriate for the big fossil fuel companies to receive such subsidies, and that the money could and should be better spent on development of clean, renewable energy technologies. Madam Acting Deputy President, the government has adopted the Greens' initiative to reform the fringe benefits tax concessions on company cars. So we'll have a flat tax rate of 20% regardless of the kilometres travelled. That will raise $1 billion in the forward estimates. It is something, of course, the opposition won't go along with, in this incredibly irresponsible presentation tonight, which is gifting everybody and costing no one, and is very short, most of all, on responsibility. Madam Acting Deputy President, the Greens would establish a sovereign wealth fund. This has the support of economic experts, including, if I read him correctly, the Governor of the Reserve Bank, Glenn Stevens, and just in the last week, the International Monetary Fund. There are about 37 countries which have such funds. There are currently $5 trillion in sovereign wealth funds around the world, and this will double to $10 trillion by 2015, but not here in Australia under Labor, and not here in Australia under the Coalition. But it would be, were the Greens to be able to follow through policy responsibly on behalf of the Australian people and their future. It would be able to fund such important future infrastructure as high-speed rail in this country, rapidly carrying Australians in clean, fast, efficient and cheap transport between Brisbane and Sydney, or Sydney via Canberra to Melbourne in 3 to 4 hours. The Greens would fund that through a proper resource take from our booming mining industry through a sovereign wealth fund. Neither of the other parties will have the wherewithal to be able to get Australia into the high-speed lane for rail. Madam Acting Deputy President, solar power, geothermal and other renewables deserve much greater investment in this sunny country, as does grid infrastructure, which is a critical component of a future clean energy base. The Obama administration has recognised grid infrastructure as a critical enabler for renewables, similar to the way Labor here, backed by the Greens, recognises broadband as critical infrastructure. And we would strengthen and promote our cultural institutions, not cut them, as in this budget. The government has increased the efficiency dividends on the public sector from, that is, the cuts, from 1.25% to 1.5% for 2 years, and that'll raise $1 billion in the forward estimates. We can't put a dollar figure on the savings from these cuts, that is, the impact of these cuts, but the damaging cost of this on some of our national cultural institutions is emerging. Jobs and programs will be cut at the National Gallery. Exhibitions will be cut from 12 to 5 in the coming years. There will be cuts to travelling exhibitions which will impact on regional Australia. 30% of jobs are at risk in the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies. 17 jobs will go from the National Library and similar from the National Museum. 7 jobs and fleet vessels are threatened at the National Maritime Museum and the National Archives. Screen Australia will be hit. So will the Australian Film, Television and Radio School and the Australian Council for the Arts. All these are totally unnecessarily facing the razor. Australia's pride in these institutions is unlimited, but they are going to feel the razor from Labor, and of course they would be cut even more deeply under the Abbott prescription put to this parliament tonight. He overlooked them totally. Well, the Greens will be in there advocating for the restoration of funding to these great institutions in the coming weeks and months. On a brighter note, I can congratulate the government on its continuing increase in the overseas aid budget. That has reached 3.5% gross national income, $4,836 million, up from the $4,361 million of the last budget. Particularly welcome in this is the increased focus on basic education in the countries where we spend that aid money for primary schools and in-country teacher training, and $96 million of new funding allocated to violence against women initiatives, and the doubling of funding that will be delivered and therefore better targeted, not through governments but through non-government organisations. Madam Acting Deputy President, I thank the government for some important Greens initiatives taken up in this budget. There will be a parliamentary budget office that's going to be given $24.9 million over the coming 4 years, so that this parliament will be able to readily cost proposals like the Leader of the Opposition's uncosted budget tonight through an independent established parliamentary budget office. There we are catching up on other countries, and this will be a real achievement for the Greens, which is going to serve this parliament and give greater prudence to political promises and schemes to the people of Australia for the decades to come. I acknowledge, along with the Leader of the Opposition, the role played by all parties, but in particular the community sector, in the much better spending on mental health. $2.2 billion over the forward estimates, over the coming 5 years, with $1.5 billion in new money for mental health investment over the next 5 years. And I give credit amongst the many people involved here to my colleague Senator Rachel Siewert. From the Greens also has come, and it was written into our agreement with the government, a move to better fund dental health care in this country. In this budget there's $53 million for 150 dental internships over the coming 4 years. But that is just a marker of things to come. The National Advisory Council on Dental Health will be established to provide advice on dental health in this country. And I quote from the budget, "Significant reforms in line with the government's agreement with the Australian Greens will be a priority in the 2012-2013 budget." And I know from a medical background that if you give good dental health to Australians, you give them good general health. And if you give good general health to Australians, you save not only a great deal of illness, but billions of dollars to the national economy. Madam Acting Deputy President, here are some of the worst of the welfare measures in this Labor budget. Payments will be slashed to some single mothers with teenage children by $56 a year. Now, a week. Madam Acting Deputy President, I look at the Sydney Morning Herald report related to this matter and quote from Adele Horan. "At least 50,000 sole parents with teenage children will be financially worse off, even if they are working as a result of new welfare-to-work measures announced in the budget." The Chief Executive of the National Council on Single Mothers and Children, Therese Edwards, described the measure as harsh, mean-spirited and unnecessary. From January 1, 2013, the mothers of children aged 12 to 15 will be moved from the parenting payment single to the Newstart allowance, resulting in a loss of $56 a week. This measure will apply even when sole parents are already fulfilling participation requirements by working at least 15 hours a week. Instead of being able to combine part-time earnings with a part parenting payment, they will be entitled to a portion of the much lower Newstart allowance. The President of the Sole Parents Union, Kathleen Swinburne, said the shift was simply a budget-saving measure, and I quote, "It's rather feeble when the people who can afford it the least have to help to fix the budget deficit. It's cruel, it's unnecessary, and we will be trying to engage the government in ameliorating that item." The budget also includes a teenage mother's so-called education trial program, where mothers will be required to participate when their baby is 6 months, and compulsory activity such as education or training will be brought in when the child turns 1 year old, for goodness sake. Harsher requirements for the disability support pension, and there will be threatens thousands of Australians with a disability. And if there's one item we are very attracted to and congratulate the opposition, it's $20,000 to parents of most disabled children, which inherently we expect will be part of any future program that the opposition brings forward. Madam Acting Deputy President, the Greens are committed to improving this budget, not as Mr Abbott would have it, wrecking the budget. The Greens will scrutinise all these welfare measures to see if they are necessary, and with a view to removing some of the harshest thorns. The economies of climate change are on the agenda, as Mr Abbott said in his budget reply speech. This budget has to be seen in the context of that huge issue with which the Greens and my colleagues Senator Milne and Adam Bandt, the honourable member for Melbourne, are focused on, including establishing a carbon price, ending the destruction of the nation's forests. And, Madam Acting Deputy President, how Labor must regret having not taken up the former leader's offer in Tasmania of Mark Latham's offer of $800 million to end the destruction of forests in Tasmania. We are and do now have a historic opportunity to end that destruction because the industry is in economic spiral down with no end in sight. And I hope that this government, along with the Tasmanian government and following on that governments in New South Wales and Victoria, will take this historic opportunity, very similar to the opportunity the Fraser government took in 1978 to end whaling, to end the destruction of the great wild forests of Tasmania and the southeast of the mainland. Madam Acting Deputy President, the Greens are intent on bringing humanity back into the treatment of asylum seekers. My colleague Senator Hanson-Young has just yesterday had successfully placed before this Senate a motion deploring and the government's move to send asylum seekers to this country to Malaysia. We will be doing all we can, again, to have a more humane regime brought in by this government, and of course that means to offset the even crueler attitude to asylum seekers to this country inherent in what the Abbott speech tonight implied. Madam Acting Deputy President, I want to come back to the establishment of a carbon price, because that's going to be the most substantial restructuring of the Australian economy in decades. In 2007, the Stern Review, described as the most comprehensive review ever carried out on the economics of climate change, found that the cost of not taking action on climate change will now be equivalent to 5 to 20% of the GDP each year later this century. We face, besides the economic and lifestyle destruction inherent in climate change, leaving, through our inaction, our grandchildren with an up to 20% hit on every budget in their lifetimes, trying to ameliorate the impact of climate change. The cost of action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions now, to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, could be limited to 2% of GDP if it were coordinated globally. Sir Nicholas also said, and I quote, "The benefits over time of action to shift the world onto a low-carbon path could be in the order of $2.5 trillion each year." That is, it would be better for the economy, better for jobs, better for environment and better for security of this nation and the world. Treasury estimates that Tony Abbott's direct action scheme will cost Australian taxpayers around $30 billion by 2020. It relies on paying polluters $10.5 billion to reduce their emissions, with a further $20 billion for the purchase of international permits to be bought by 2020 to reach the 5% emissions reduction target he claims. So by 2020, the total cost of Mr Abbott's plan will be $720 per household minus compensation, no compensation, leaving householders exposed while the big polluters are understrapped by payments from the taxpayers. We reject this hit on householders, again to the advantage of the big polluters, and would turn that around. The Greens carbon price plan would put a tax on big polluters, not average Australians. It would use the money raised to compensate householders, build renewable energy and public transport and support industry transition, and as such will create hundreds of thousands of jobs. According to a recent report by the Climate Institute Action on Climate Change, a modest carbon price would create 6,600 jobs directly in New South Wales alone. Madam Acting Deputy President, this isn't a Greens budget, it's a Labor budget. The Greens will deal responsibly with all budget legislation on its merits. We will not block the budget or supply, but we will look to improve it where we can in a fiscally responsible manner. However, in order to ensure stability in government, the Greens will not be supporting any opposition move which aims to wreck the budget. We will not support the destabilising and wrecking tactics of the opposition as we move to improve the legislation. I want to say this. There is more to the budget reply tonight than a thin veneer of promises to the Australian people. It is a self-invested budget reply from a leader of opposition who is hell-bent on destabilisation of the elected government and the right of Australians to be able to go to an election each 3 years. We see the strategy in this uncosted cornucopia, which does not stand any test of common sense scrutiny, as a move by Mr Abbott to look more like Mr Nice Guy when in fact he is Mr Wrecker. And the Greens have his measure. We have a job and a responsibility in this parliament to ensure that we do get stability, and we will undertake that responsibility, Madam Acting Deputy President, with a very careful scrutiny of the budget measures from the government, a dialogue with the government to improve those measures which are unnecessarily harsh or punitive on individuals or institutions. My team of Greens in this parliament and now in both houses of this parliament are committed above all not to the short-term political gain for self that we see in Mr Abbott's approach, but to the betterment of all Australians, not just the big end of town. We will be judicious in our strong response to the government and some of the measures which should not be in the budget. I have outlined tonight a revenue base which would have made this budget sing for Australians without the harsh, unnecessary lines in the budget which have been required simply because the government wants to give a massive tax break to corporations while not giving it to average Australians. Well, the coming weeks and months will test us all out. But I can assure the people of Australia, who have received generally this budget with agreement. There has been no outcry. There is some lamenting. There have been no dancing in the street. But I think generally Australians would see this as an average budget. Madam Acting Deputy President, I gave it 6 out of 10. That's because I'm more Pomerantz than Stratton. But I think that the government could do a lot better, and I will be with my team of Greens working to make it more socially just, more environmentally positive, more economically responsible and more fair in the country of a fair go, ending to the two-speed economy by making sure the mass of Australians in the slow lane do better, and they won't under this budget and they do worse under Mr Abbott, and turning around the growing gap between wealth and poverty, luxury and harshness, which we see in this country under our very eyes. We are a humane party, we are environmentally responsible, and we are politically savvy. And in this milieu of headbutting between the government and a very aggressive, self-invested opposition, we are up to the task of getting Australians all not only a better outcome from this budget, but a better outcome from all the work that we are undertaking in this great parliament of Australia.